Alexandria, 30 BC. She already knew he was coming. Octavian's army had been moving toward Alexandria for days, and Cleopatra had people watching every road. She knew the number of his legions. She knew the pace of his march. She knew, with the precision of a woman who had spent her entire adult life reading situations faster than they could read her, exactly how much time she had left, what she did not know, and what nobody in that palace could tell her, was the precise shape of what Octavian intended. Not her death. That was not what he wanted. A Roman triumph. The great victory parade through the streets of Rome required something specific. It required the enemy. Not a report of the enemy's defeat. Not a captured flag or a seized treasury. The enemy, in chain, walking through Roman streets while the crowd screamed, while the general rode above them on a chariot, while the whole machinery of Roman power performed. For the watching city, the spectacle of its own invincibility, Octavian needed Cleopatra alive for that parade. She was the prize. The dangerous Eastern queen who had corrupted Rome's greatest general, who had nearly pulled the empire's center of gravity away from Rome and toward Alexandria. If he could walk her through the streets of Rome in chains, the story he had been telling for years would become permanent. The war would be over not just on the battlefield but in the imagination of every Roman who watched her pass. She understood this completely, and she understood something else. Something that the sources from this period, written by people who served Octavian's version of events, tend to move past quickly because it is inconvenient. The parade was not her only option. This is where the story of Cleopatra actually begins. Not with beauty, not with Caesar, not with the famous scene that later writers would turn into something between legend and fantasy. It begins here, in a palace in Alexandria, in the last weeks of 30 BC, with a woman doing what she had done her entire life, reading the room and deciding what it required. How did the last Pharaoh of Egypt become the woman Rome could not stop talking about for 2,000 years? That is not a simple question, and the answer is not the one Rome wanted you to believe. Chapter 1. Born at the end of a world. There is a specific kind of inheritance that looks like wealth from the outside and feels like a countdown from the inside. Cleopatra was born in 69 BC into the most famous dynasty in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Ptolemies had ruled Egypt for nearly 250 years. Their capital, Alexandria, was the second largest city in the world. The library that bore the city's name held more accumulated human knowledge than any building that had ever existed. The harbour was one of the busiest in the ancient world. Ships from Rome, from Greece, from Arabia, from India moved in and out of its waters, carrying grain and spices and glass and papyrus and the 1,000 other things that the ancient world ran on. From the outside, it looked like the center of everything. From the inside, it was a dynasty in the final stages of a very slow collapse. The Ptolemies were not Egyptian in the way the word might suggest. They were Macedonian Greeks, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals, who had taken control of Egypt after Alexander died, and the empire he built in 13 years began immediately coming apart. For 250 years, they had ruled from Alexandria as Greek kings over an Egyptian population, speaking Greek in their palace, marrying within their own family to a degree that makes the word incestuous feel insufficient, and maintaining a careful distance from the actual culture of the land they governed. They worshipped the Egyptian gods when it was politically useful. They wore the double crown of the pharaohs in official portraits. They allowed themselves to be depicted in temple carvings in the ancient Egyptian style. Rigid and formal and eternal, but in the palace, in the court, in the language of power, they remained Greek. The people they ruled, the farmers along the Nile and the priests in the temples and the merchants in the delta cities, remained Egyptian. 250 years of shared geography had not produced anything resembling genuine integration. It had produced, instead, a dynasty that was Hellenistic in culture and exhausted in everything else. By the time Cleopatra was born, the Ptolemaic kingdom had been shrinking for generations, not always through military defeat, often through the simpler and more humiliating process of Roman interference. Rome had been growing for 2 centuries, with the specific momentum of something that cannot be stopped by any single decision or any single battle, only by its own eventual weight. Rome had absorbed Greece. Rome had absorbed most of the eastern Mediterranean. Rome had, by the 1st century BC, reached the point where it was the organizing fact of the known world. Every kingdom that still existed did so because Rome had not yet decided to absorb it, or because Rome found it more useful as a client than as a province. Egypt was the most valuable piece, still standing outside direct Roman control. Her father was Ptolemy XII. History remembers him by a nickname that tells you almost everything you need to know about how his own people regarded him. They called him Orlets, the flute player, not because he was a gifted musician, though he may have been, because his contemporaries considered him a performer rather than a ruler, a man who played the instrument of Roman favor while his kingdom slowly lost the ability to determine its own future. Ptolemy XII spent enormous sums bribing Roman senators and generals to recognize his claim to the Egyptian throne as legitimate. He borrowed money from Roman financiers at ruinous interest rates to pay those bribes. He raised taxes on ordinary Egyptians to service those debts. When his own people rose against him in protest, he fled to Rome and spent 3 years lobbying for Roman military support to put down the rebellion against him. He came back with Roman soldiers at his side and reasserted his rule over a population that had just watched their king abandon them and return with foreign troops to punish them for objecting. This is the world Cleopatra was born into, not at the height of a dynasty. At its reckoning, she was the 3rd of what would eventually be 6 children, born into a family where the word family carried a meaning that most families would not recognize. The Ptolemaic court was not a place of warmth or safety or the ordinary textures of childhood. It was a place of permanent political calculation, where every sibling was a potential rival, where every parent was a potential threat, and where the distance between royal favor and royal execution was measured, not in time, but in circumstance. Her mother disappears from the historical record when Cleopatra was still young. The exact circumstances are not clear, which is itself a kind of testimony about life in that palace. Deaths that were convenient tended not to be explained in detail. She had an older sister named Berenice IV, who seized the throne while their father was in Rome lobbying for support. She ruled for 3 years. Ptolemy XII returned with Roman soldiers, retook what was his, and had Berenice executed. Cleopatra was somewhere between 10 and 12 years old when this happened. She was living in that palace when her sister was killed on their father's order. She was not sheltered from this. There was no sheltering from it. This was the education the palace provided, whether you wanted it or not. But the palace provided something else as well, something that the story of Cleopatra almost never gives adequate weight to, because it is less dramatic than murder and more difficult to make into a scene. It provided access Alexandria had the greatest library in the ancient world and the greatest concentration of scholars and scientists and philosophers that had ever existed in one place. The Ptolemies had built it and funded it and maintained it as a point of dynastic pride. For a child growing up in the palace, this meant access to knowledge that no one else on earth could match. Cleopatra used it. The ancient sources are consistent on this point, even when they disagree on almost everything else about her. She was educated. Deeply, seriously, unusually educated for anyone in her time. And remarkably so for a woman in her position. She studied philosophy and mathematics and astronomy. She read widely in history. She engaged with medicine and with the natural sciences as they were understood in her era. And she learned languages. Ancient writers credited her with command of many languages, perhaps as many as 9. Greek, obviously, which was her native tongue, Egyptian, Latin, Ethiopian, Hebrew, Aramaic, others. The exact number matters less than what it represented a ruler who had decided, before she held any real power, that understanding the people across the table before they understood her was itself a form of power. And here is the detail that reveals more about who Cleopatra was than almost anything else in the historical record. She was the first ruler in the Ptolemaic dynasty to learn to speak Egyptian. 250 years, 8 or 9 monarchs before her, depending on how you count, and not one of them had learned the language of the people they ruled. She did, not because it was required, not because any advisor told her she needed to. There is no record of anyone instructing the young princess to learn the language of the farmers and the priests and the ordinary people of the Nile. She learned it because she had decided, somewhere in the years of her formation, that if she was going to rule Egypt, she was going to understand it, not manage it from a Greek-speaking palace above it. Understand it. That decision, made by a young woman in a palace that was already failing, is the first true glimpse of the mind that Rome would eventually need to destroy twice. She was not born into stability. She was not born into a dynasty at its height. She was born into a countdown, in a palace where the people closest to her were the most dangerous, in a kingdom that was slowly being absorbed by an empire it could not resist. And she spent her childhood getting ready, not for survival in the narrow sense, for something larger, for the possibility, which she could not have articulated as a child, but which the evidence of her entire adult life suggests she understood very early, that the world she was born into could be met differently than the way her father had met it. Ptolemy XII had met Rome with money and deference, and the desperate energy of a man trying to preserve his position by making himself useful. His daughter was learning 9 languages and reading everything in the greatest library in the world. The difference between those 2 approaches to the same problem would take years to become visible, but it was already there, already being built, quietly, in the palace of a dying dynasty, by a girl who had understood something that her father never quite managed to grasp. The world does not give you a place in it. You have to build one, and then you have to be ready to defend it against everything that wants to take it away. Chapter 2. The Palace That Taught Her Power. There is a kind of knowledge that cannot be learned from books. Cleopatra had access to the greatest library in the ancient world, and she used it with a seriousness that most people in her position never bothered to demonstrate. But the most important education she received in those years did not come from scrolls or scholars or the philosophers who passed through Alexandria on their way to somewhere else. It came from watching. The Ptolemaic court was, by any honest accounting, one of the most dangerous environments a person could grow up in during the 1st century BC. Not dangerous in the way that battlefields are dangerous, where the threat is visible and the direction of it is clear. Dangerous in the way that closed systems of power are always dangerous, where the threat wears a familiar face and arrives at a moment you did not anticipate, where the people most likely to destroy you are the people sitting across from you at dinner. The history of the Ptolemaic dynasty reads, in stretches, like a catalogue of family violence. Brothers killed sisters, mothers killed sons, sons killed mothers, wives killed husbands, with a regularity that suggests the family had developed, over generations, a specific relationship with murder as a political instrument. This was not unique to the Ptolemies. Royal families across the ancient world operated by similar logic, when the prize is absolute power and the competitors are the people you share blood with. The calculation of self-interest tends to produce outcomes that ordinary family life does not, but knowing that intellectually and living inside it are two entirely different things. Cleopatra lived inside it. Her older sister Berenice IV had seized the throne while their father was in Rome. She had ruled for 3 years. Ptolemy XII came back with Roman soldiers, retook what was his, and had Berenice executed. The method, according to the sources, was strangulation. Cleopatra was somewhere between 10 and 12 years old. She did not watch the execution. There is no record of that. But she was in the palace. She was in the city. She lived in the days after, in the rooms that her sister had recently occupied, surrounded by courtiers who had served one ruler and now served another, and who had, in the space of a single political transition, demonstrated everything she needed to understand about the nature of loyalty in that world. It was not loyalty. It was proximity to power, wearing loyalty's clothes. This is the first thing the palace taught her. The people around you are reading the situation the same way you are. The question they are always asking, even when they smile and bow and speak words of devotion, is the question that determines everything. Where is the power going? And how do I position myself to remain close to it? She learned to read that question in people, not by being told to, by watching the way courtiers shifted after her sister's fall, the way certain faces changed when certain names were mentioned, the way the temperature of a room could drop by a degree that was imperceptible unless you were paying the right kind of attention. She paid the right kind of attention. The second thing the palace taught her was about her father. Ptolemy XII was not a stupid man. He had correctly identified the primary threat to his dynasty and had chosen a response that kept him alive and on the throne for decades. The response was submission, expensive, humiliating, strategically coherent submission to Roman power. He paid what Rome required. He asked for what Rome could provide. He survived. But survival and rule are not the same thing, and watching her father survive taught Cleopatra something she would spend the rest of her life applying from the opposite direction. Ptolemy XII had made himself useful to Rome. His daughter was watching what happened to men who were merely useful. They were kept, they were managed, they were tolerated, right up until the moment they were not, and then they were replaced with someone more convenient. Useful was not enough. Useful could be discarded. What could not be discarded was necessary. And necessary was something different entirely. Necessary meant that your removal created a problem for the person considering removing you. Necessary meant that the calculation of getting rid of you was more complicated than the calculation of keeping you. Necessary was the only position from which a ruler without Rome's military power could negotiate with Rome on anything resembling equal terms. She was not old enough to articulate this. She was old enough to feel it, and the feeling, absorbed before she had the language to examine it, shaped the way she moved through every political situation that followed. Her father died in 51 BC. She was 18 years old. The will he left behind was, in its own way, his most revealing act. He left the throne jointly to Cleopatra and to her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was approximately 10 years old at the time. Joint rule between siblings was Ptolemaic tradition, rooted partly in the old Egyptian practice and partly in the dynasty's habit of marrying brothers to sisters to consolidate bloodlines. In theory, it distributed power. In practice, it created a permanent contest between the two people sharing the title, and the outcome of that contest was determined by who controlled the advisors, the military, and the machinery of the court. A 10-year-old king controlled none of those things. His advisors did, 3 men in particular. Pothinus, a eunuch who had served as the chief administrator of the court and who had spent years cultivating influence over the young Ptolemy. Archigas, the commander of the royal army, a professional soldier with the specific loyalties of men who serve power rather than principle. And Theodotus, a rhetorician from Chios who served as the young king's tutor and who had shaped his students' thinking in directions that happened to align with his own interests. These 3 men did not want Cleopatra on the throne, not because they had personal animosity toward her, though they may have, because a competent adult ruler was a threat to the particular arrangement of influence they had built around an incompetent child ruler. She was the obstacle between them and the actual exercise of power. And obstacles in the Ptolemaic court had a short life expectancy. What followed in the first 3 years of her reign was a slow-motion power struggle conducted through the instruments available to people who cannot move against each other openly without consequences. Cleopatra issued decrees and made decisions with the authority of the senior ruler. Pothinus and Achilles worked to undermine those decisions, to redirect resources, to build the case within the court that her judgment was unreliable, her position untenable. She was not passive in this. She moved around Egypt in these years in a way that Ptolemaic rulers almost never did. They governed from Alexandria, from the palace, from the administrative center of the kingdom. She went to the temples. She met with priests in their own sanctuaries, spoke to them in Egyptian, participated in religious ceremonies in ways that her predecessors had always conducted at a distance or through intermediaries. She visited the grain-producing regions of the Delta. She moved through the country in a manner that communicated something to the people who saw her that no decree from a palace could communicate. She was present in a tradition that stretched back thousands of years, where the Pharaoh was the intermediary between the human and the divine. Presence was not a small thing. The priests who saw her perform the rites correctly, in their language, with the knowledge of someone who had actually studied what the ceremonies meant, were not looking at a Greek princess condescending to visit them. They were looking at something they had not seen from the palace in 250 years, someone who had made the choice to actually be their pharaoh. It was not enough. Not yet. In 48 BC. The move came. The exact sequence of events is disputed in the sources, which is characteristic of coups that succeed. What is clear is the result. Cleopatra was forced out of Alexandria, stripped of the practical exercise of power, if not the formal title, driven east toward the Syrian border with whatever she could carry and whoever was willing to follow her. She was 21 years old. She had been queen for 3 years, and she was now on the wrong side of the border of her own kingdom. sleeping in tents in the desert, building an army from local forces and whatever resources she could assemble, preparing to fight her way back to a throne that was formally still hers and practically no longer under her control. No Caesar yet. No Antony. No Roman general arriving to resolve the situation in her favor. Just Cleopatra. In the desert. Getting ready. This is the part of her story that 2,000 years of legend have most thoroughly buried. The image of her that survived, the image that Shakespeare built on and Elizabeth Taylor embodied, and that remains the dominant picture in the popular imagination, is an image of a woman defined by her relationships with powerful men. Caesar gave her back her throne. Antony gave her a second chance. The men are the agents. She is the object of their agency. But in the desert, east of Alexandria, in 48 BC, there were no Roman men. There was no rescue coming. There was a 21-year-old woman who had been betrayed by her father's court, driven out of her own palace, and separated from the administrative and military apparatus she needed to rule. And she was not waiting. She was not despairing. She was building an army. That is who she was before Rome ever entered her story. The world was about to find out. Chapter 3. The prize Rome could not ignore. The reason her exile mattered was not only that a queen had lost her throne, it was that the throne she lost controlled, the one kingdom Rome could not afford to ignore. Her father had borrowed money from Roman financiers to keep his throne. The interest on that debt was paid by Egyptian farmers who had never seen Rome and never would. That is what Egypt meant to the people who held power over it. Not a civilization, a balance sheet, but to understand every decision Cleopatra made from this point forward, every alliance she built, and every risk she took, and every calculation she ran in the years ahead. You need to understand what she was actually fighting for. Not the throne. Thrones can be replaced. Rulers can be substituted. The Ptolemaic dynasty had proven that with depressing regularity across 250 years, she was fighting for Egypt, and Egypt, in 48 BC, was not what most people today picture when they hear the word. It was not primarily the land of pyramids and mummies and the distant grandeur of a civilization 4,000 years old. Those things existed. The monuments were there. The temples were standing. The priests maintained rituals that stretched back to a time so remote that even the Egyptians of Cleopatra's era regarded it with something approaching awe. But Egypt, in the 1st century BC, was, above everything else, a machine. The most productive agricultural machine in the ancient world. The Nile was the reason. Every year, between June and September, the Nile rose and overflowed its banks and deposited across the delta and the valley a layer of dark, mineral-rich silt that turned the land on either side of the river into some of the most fertile soil in the world. When the waters receded, the farmers planted what grew in that soil, fed by millennia of accumulated nutrient, was grain in quantities that the rocky hillsides of Greece and the dry plains of Italy could not come close to producing. Egypt fed itself and had an enormous surplus left over. Rome in the 1st century BC had a population somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people in the city itself. Feeding that population required constant, reliable supply lines from the most productive agricultural regions available. Egypt provided a significant portion of that supply. The grain ships that sailed from Alexandria to the port of Ostia were not carrying a luxury or a supplement. They were carrying a necessity. Roman politicians who understood this, and the smart ones did, understood that whoever controlled the flow of Egyptian grain controlled something more fundamental than any army or any political alliance. They controlled hunger, and hunger, in a city of 1 million people, was the most powerful political force in the ancient world. Beyond grain, there was Alexandria itself. The city was the commercial hub of the Eastern Mediterranean in a way that had no equivalent anywhere else. Its harbour, protected by the lighthouse of Pharaoh, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, could accommodate hundreds of ships simultaneously. The goods that moved through that harbour connected 2 trading worlds that would otherwise have been separated by geography and logistics. From the east came spices from India, silk, ivory from Africa, precious stones from Arabia. From the west came Roman manufactured goods, Italian wine, Spanish silver. Alexandria sat at the intersection of these flows and taxed them, and the revenue generated by that taxation made the Ptolemaic treasury the wealthiest in the region. Egypt was, in short, the single most valuable piece of real estate in the ancient world, and Rome knew it. Rome had been managing Egypt as a dependency rather than a conquest for most of the century before Cleopatra's birth. The arrangement suited Rome because a client kingdom that paid tribute and provided grain and stayed out of Roman internal politics was more valuable than a province that required a garrison and an administrator and the constant attention of the imperial machinery. But client kingdoms had a structural vulnerability. They depended on the client being sufficiently competent and sufficiently compliant to manage the relationship from their end. When the client was neither, as Ptolemy XII had demonstrated, Rome had to intervene, and Roman intervention always carried the same long-term implication. Once Rome was inside a situation, it did not fully leave. It stayed, in the form of creditors and political patrons and military advisors, and the steady accumulation of influence that preceded formal control by years or decades. By the time Cleopatra came to the throne, Rome had not annexed Egypt, but Rome had made Egypt's continued independence conditional on Egyptian behavior in ways that left very little room for genuine independence. The kingdom existed because Rome allowed it to exist. The throne was occupied because Rome recognized its occupant. Cleopatra understood this better than her father had. Ptolemy XII had understood Rome as a threat to be appeased. His daughter understood it as a system to be navigated. The difference sounds subtle. It was enormous. Appeasement is reactive. It responds to what the more powerful party demands, tries to satisfy those demands at minimum cost, and hopes that satisfaction will produce security. It does not. It produces a dynamic in which the more powerful party learns that demands will be met, and therefore continues making them. Navigation is different. Navigation requires understanding the system well enough to find the paths through it that serve your interests, while appearing to serve the interests of the people who control the system. It requires knowing what the powerful party wants before they articulate them, and positioning yourself to provide it in a way that makes you indispensable rather than merely compliant. She had spent her entire childhood and adolescence studying Rome, not as an abstraction, as a living system of interests and personalities and pressures and vulnerabilities. She had watched her father navigate that system badly and had formed, through the watching, a much clearer picture of how it actually worked. Rome did not want to destroy Egypt. Destruction was expensive and counterproductive. Rome wanted to control Egypt's output without bearing the administrative cost of direct rule. The ideal arrangement, from Rome's perspective, was an Egyptian ruler who was capable enough to keep the machine running, compliant enough to direct its output toward Roman needs, and weak enough to be managed if compliance faltered. The question that Cleopatra had been turning over since her adolescence was whether there was a version of this arrangement that left room for something Rome had not accounted for. A ruler who was capable enough to keep the machine running. Yes. And compliant enough to maintain the relationship. Yes. But also strong enough and smart enough and sufficiently embedded in both Egyptian and Roman political culture to turn the dependency into something closer to partnership, not subservience. Partnership. It was an audacious idea. And then her father died and her brother's advisors moved against her, and she was in the desert with an army and no immediate prospect of using it. And the long-term strategy had to wait while the immediate survival problem got solved. But here is the thing about the immediate survival problem. In the summer of 48 BC, two events happened in rapid succession that changed the situation entirely. The first was in Greece. Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome, defeated his rival Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus and effectively ended the Roman civil war that had been consuming the Republic's energy for years. Pompey fled east. The second was in Egypt. Pompey, seeking refuge, arrived off the coast of Alexandria and sent word ashore requesting sanctuary. The advisors of Ptolemy XIII, calculating quickly, decided that sheltering Rome's loser was less valuable than delivering him to Rome's winner. Pompey was invited to come ashore. He was killed in a small boat before he reached the beach, by men who smiled at him as they drew their blades. His head was cut off and preserved, a gift for Caesar, who was already sailing toward Egypt. The desert, east of Alexandria, suddenly contained something it had not contained the day before. An opportunity. Cleopatra saw it before almost anyone else did. She had been reading political situations since she was a child, in a palace where misreading them could get you killed. And that practice had built in her a capacity to see the shape of a situation before others had finished registering that the situation had changed. Caesar was coming to Alexandria. He was the most powerful man in the world, and he had just won a war, and he was going to land in a city where two claimants to the Egyptian throne were locked in a conflict that could go either way. One of those claimants, the one currently in power, had just handed him the severed head of his enemy as a welcome gift. Caesar was going to have opinions about that. She had to get into the room. And, getting into the room, when the room was controlled by people who would kill her before she reached the door, was going to require the thing that the palace had taught her to produce under conditions of extreme pressure: a plan. Chapter 4. Before Caesar, she had already survived. Let us be precise about something. Caesar did not rescue Cleopatra. This is the version that 2,000 years of storytelling have deposited into the popular imagination, like sediment, layer by layer, until it feels like bedrock. The powerful Roman general arrives in Egypt, finds a brilliant young queen in danger, and intervenes on her behalf. She is the prize to be rescued. He is the agent of her restoration. The story of her reclaiming her throne becomes, in this version, a chapter in his story rather than her own. It is wrong, not as interpretation. As basic chronology, when Julius Caesar's fleet appeared off the coast of Alexandria in the autumn of 48 BC, Cleopatra was not waiting to be saved. She was at the head of an army on the eastern border of Egypt, preparing to fight her way back into her own kingdom. She had been building that army for months. She had recruited soldiers from the local populations of the border regions, had assembled supplies, had organized the logistical infrastructure that any military campaign requires if it is going to move and fight rather than simply exist. She was not a refugee. She was a commander in the field. engaged in an active military campaign against her brother's forces, who were positioned just across the border waiting to stop her. The army she had built was not large enough to guarantee victory. It might have won. It might have lost. But the key word is that she was there, in the field, with an army, with a plan. Before the Roman ships arrived, Caesar arriving did not create her options. It added one, and she took it with the speed of someone who had already been thinking about exactly this kind of opening for months. To understand what she was thinking, you have to understand what Caesar was walking into. He arrived in Alexandria, expecting a manageable situation. Pompey was dead. The civil war was effectively over. He needed to settle accounts in the eastern Mediterranean, collect what Rome was owed from various client kingdoms, and manage the transition back to something resembling normal Roman political life. Egypt was on the list because Egypt always owed Rome money, and because the political situation there, with two siblings fighting over a throne, was the kind of instability that Rome preferred to resolve in favor of whoever was going to be most useful. What he found instead was considerably more complicated. Ptolemy XIII's advisors had made two serious miscalculations in quick succession. The first was the murder of Pompey, which Caesar received not with gratitude, but with visible anger. Pompey had been his enemy, and his son-in-law and a Roman consul, and his summary execution by the agents of a foreign court, without Roman authorization, was an insult to Roman dignity that Caesar was not inclined to overlook. The second miscalculation was the assumption that Caesar would be manageable, that he could be flattered and given gifts and steered towards supporting the existing arrangement. Caesar was not manageable. He was one of the most politically sophisticated operators in the history of the ancient world, and he had not survived decades of Roman politics by being the kind of person who got managed. He established himself in the royal palace in Alexandria and announced that he would arbitrate the dispute between the two siblings. Both were required to appear before him and present their cases. Ptolemy XIII arrived in Alexandria. His advisors controlled the city and controlled access to Caesar, and they had every intention of ensuring that the arbitration produced the outcome they needed. Cleopatra was on the other side of a border. With an army, she could not march into the city without triggering a battle that would make her appear to be the aggressor, surrounded by her brother's forces, cut off from the one room where her future was going to be decided. She could not walk through the front door. She needed another way in. What happened next has been told and retold so many times, and in such varying registers of drama and romance and condescension, that the actual operational reality of it has been almost completely obscured. Plutarch, writing a century and a half after the event, describes her being wrapped in a bed, covering and carried by a trusted companion into the palace. Later tellings transformed this into a carpet, later still into something approaching an erotic fantasy about a woman using her body to gain access to a man. Here is what actually happened, as best the historical record allows us to reconstruct it. Cleopatra needed to get into the palace, past people who would stop her if they identified her. She chose a method of concealment. She chose a trusted companion to carry her. And she chose the right moment. The method worked. She arrived in Caesar's presence. That is the operational reality. A displaced ruler used basic tradecraft to penetrate a hostile environment and reach the person she needed to reach. The rest is what Rome needed the story to be. Now comes the meeting itself. And here is where the most consequential gap in the historical record lives. We do not know what was said in that room. Plutarch was not there. No one who wrote about it was there. What we have is the outcome. And the outcome tells us, if we read it carefully, more about what happened than any invented dialogue could. Caesar chose to support her. She had read Caesar the way she read everyone. She understood what he needed from Egypt. She understood what Egypt needed from him. She spoke his language, without an interpreter between them, and she made her case. The woman who had taught herself Egyptian when no ruler before her had bothered, who had mastered the languages of every major people around her, walked into that room without needing anyone to translate what she was saying or what she meant, and Caesar, who had spent a lifetime surrounded by people who told him what he wanted to hear, encountered someone who told him what he needed to know. He shows her side, not immediately, not without deliberation. The situation in Alexandria became violent almost immediately after her arrival, with fighting breaking out between Caesar's forces and the Egyptian army under Achilles. This was not a small skirmish. This was urban warfare in one of the largest cities in the world, lasting months, with Caesar at genuine risk at multiple points. During this period, he and Cleopatra were effectively confined to the palace complex together, which is when, the sources agree, their relationship became something beyond political alliance. Let us not pretend that did not happen. It did. But romantic relationships between political operators at the highest level of power are never only romantic, and pretending otherwise is not generosity toward the people involved. It is condescension. She was not swept away. She was calculating, as she always calculated, with her eyes open and her understanding of the situation fully engaged. The war in Alexandria ended in the spring of 47 BC, when Roman reinforcements arrived and the tide turned decisively. Ptolemy XIII was killed, drowned in the Nile while trying to escape. Arsinoe, Cleopatra's younger sister, who had sided with Ptolemy's faction and had herself declared queen during the fighting, was captured. She would eventually be displayed in Caesar's triumph in Rome. When the fighting ended, Cleopatra was queen of Egypt, but here is the accounting that the legend skips. She had been queen before Caesar arrived. She had held the title since her father's death. She had ruled, however contested, for 3 years before being forced out. She had built an army in exile. She had identified the opportunity that Caesar's arrival represented and had moved to exploit it faster and more decisively than anyone around her. She had gotten herself into the room, made the argument, and secured the outcome. Caesar provided military force. She provided everything else. The Rome-centric version of this story needed Caesar to be the protagonist. It needed Cleopatra to be the object of a powerful man's decision. It needed the seduction narrative, because the seduction narrative made her passive, made her dependent, made her the kind of figure whose rise could be explained by biology rather than by capability. The record, read carefully, produces a different picture. Two extraordinarily capable political operators recognized each other across a meeting that neither of them had engineered under ideal circumstances. Each had something the other needed. Each was smart enough to see it quickly. And part of what she was calculating, from the moment Caesar chose her side, was what came next, because Caesar would not stay in Egypt forever. He had a Roman world to manage. He had wars to finish, and political arrangements to consolidate, and enemies to watch. He had come to Alexandria to resolve a problem, and he had resolved it, and at some point, probably sooner than she would choose, he was going to leave. When he left, she would be alone. She had been there before. She knew how to do it. What she was thinking about. In the months that Caesar stayed, and in the months that clearly changed the relationship between them from political alliance to something more personal, was the longer game. The question of whether there was an arrangement between Egypt and Rome that could survive the departure of any individual Roman, that could root itself in something more durable than one man's preference and military support. She was pregnant by the time Caesar left Alexandria in the spring of 47 BC. The child that would be born a few months later, the child she would name Ptolemy Caesar, and that the Egyptians would call Caesarion, Little Caesar, was not an accident. Nothing in Cleopatra's life was an accident. It was a piece in a game being played at a scale that most of the people around her could not fully see. A child with Caesar's blood was a claim, a living argument, a physical embodiment of the connection between the Ptolemaic dynasty and the most powerful name in Rome. Whatever happened to Caesar, whatever political storms came next, that child existed, and existence, in the world of ancient power, was a kind of argument that could not be unsaid. Chapter 5. Caesar. The room she had to enter. We have already established how she got into the room. Now we need to talk about what the room cost her to enter, and what it cost her to leave. Because the room was not a room. It was a transaction, and transactions at the highest level of power always have terms that are not written down, that are understood by both parties and acknowledged by neither. Because acknowledging them would change the nature of what is being exchanged. Julius Caesar was 52 years old when he met Cleopatra. He had survived the Roman Senate, survived Pompey, survived a civil war that had consumed the Republic for years, survived assassination plots and political reversals, and the specific, grinding attrition of being at the top of the most competitive political system the ancient world had ever produced. He was experienced in the way that only people who have been in genuine danger for extended periods of time become experienced. He could read people. He could read situations. He was not easily impressed. She was 21. She had one night to make an impression that would last long enough to change the outcome of a war. What did she bring into that room? The legend says beauty. The legend has been saying beauty for 2,000 years. And the legend is wrong in the specific way that legends are wrong when they are constructed by people with a vested interest in a particular explanation. Plutarch, who is the primary ancient source for the personal details of this meeting, says something interesting if you read him carefully. He does not describe her as extraordinarily beautiful. He says that her beauty was not incomparable in itself. What he describes, what he actually uses the ancient Greek words to point toward, is something harder to translate and considerably more interesting. A quality of presence, an irresistible quality of engagement, a voice he describes as like an instrument with many strings, capable of moving between languages and registers, and the particular frequency of whoever she was talking to, with the ease of someone for whom this was not performance, but nature. That is a description of intelligence deployed socially. It is a description of someone who had spent years learning how people worked, and had become extraordinarily good at making people feel understood. Caesar, in his 52 years, had met a great many extraordinary women. He had met very few people who could keep up with him. She could keep up with him. Across the full range of subjects that interested a man who had written military commentaries of enduring literary quality, while simultaneously running one of the most complex military and political operations in ancient history. She spoke his language without a translator. She knew Rome not as a distant power to be feared, but as a system she had studied and partially understood. She knew what he needed, and she knew what she could offer, and she made the case in terms that a man who had spent his life doing cost-benefit analysis on the largest possible scale could not dismiss. This is what happened in that room. Not seduction in the narrow sense. Recognition. The specific and rare experience of two exceptional minds encountering each other and finding, in the encounter, something that neither had expected. He stayed in Egypt far longer than his military objectives required. Caesar had arrived in Alexandria in the autumn of 48 BC. The military situation was resolved by the spring of 47 BC. By any reasonable accounting of his responsibilities, Caesar should have been on a ship back toward Rome within weeks of that resolution. He had a republic to manage, or what remained of one. He had allies to reward and enemies to watch, and the entire political infrastructure of Roman power to consolidate after years of civil war. He stayed in Egypt until June of 47 BC. He spent that time with Cleopatra. They traveled together up the Nile, on a flotilla of royal barges, moving into the interior of Egypt in a way that served no obvious military or diplomatic purpose. The ancient sources note this journey with varying degrees of discomfort. Some treat it as evidence of his infatuation. Some treat it as a strategic error. None of them quite know what to do with a Julius Caesar who is doing something that does not fit the model of relentless, pragmatic efficiency. Here is one way to read it. Caesar was seeing Egypt for the first time, with a guide who knew it better than anyone alive. Not the Egypt of Alexandria, which was essentially a Greek city that happened to be located on the Nile Delta. The Egypt of the interior, the temples that were older than Rome by a factor that was difficult to hold in the mind, the agricultural system that produced wealth at a scale that the rocky Italian peninsula could not approach, the population, tens of millions of people, living within a civilization that had been continuous for 3,000 years before Rome existed, and Cleopatra was explaining all of it, in Latin, with the knowledge of someone who had studied it, visited it, spoken to its priests in their own language, and understood it from the inside in a way that no Greek ruler of Egypt had ever bothered to. He was learning something, and what he was learning was the thing that no Roman general who came to Egypt as a conqueror could easily learn. That Egypt was not just a province to be administered. It was a civilization that had been producing complexity and wealth and cultural depth for longer than any Roman reference point could reach. And the woman showing it to him was its ruler. He left in June of 47 BC. Caesarion was born in late June or early July of the same year. Caesar acknowledged the child in what were apparently informal terms. The public, formal acknowledgement that Roman law would have required to make the child a legal heir never came. This gap between private acknowledgement and public recognition would become one of the most consequential ambiguities in the ancient world. In Egypt, Cleopatra resolved it herself. In the only jurisdiction where her resolution carried full weight, she presented Caesarion as Ptolemy Caesar, co-ruler and heir. In the temples, she had them depicted together in the ancient Egyptian style, she as Isis and he as the divine child. The imagery was unmistakable to anyone who knew the visual language of Egyptian religious tradition. She was constructing a legitimacy for her son that did not depend on Roman legal categories. Because Roman legal categories had not yet delivered what she needed, she was building the argument in the place where she had the authority to build it. Caesar arrived in Rome in the autumn of 47 BC and began consolidating his position. Cleopatra came to Rome in 46 BC and stayed for nearly 2 years, living in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, receiving visitors, meeting senators and intellectuals and the various figures of Roman public life who came to see, or to assess. The woman from Alexandria, she brought Caesarion. She moved through Roman society with the self-possession of a reigning monarch visiting a foreign capital. which was precisely what she was. She made people uncomfortable, not in the ways that later propaganda would suggest. She made people uncomfortable in the way that highly competent women have always made certain kinds of men uncomfortable, by demonstrating, simply through the quality of her engagement and the breadth of her knowledge and the evident confidence of her manner, that the categories they had prepared for her did not fit. She was supposed to be an Eastern queen, a client roulé, a woman in a man's world, present because a powerful man had brought her there. She behaved like a head of state, because she was one. Cicero, one of the most eminent Romans of his era and one of the sharpest observers of Roman public life, mentions her in his letters. His tone is not friendly. He found her arrogant. He was bothered by her in a way that he was not bothered by foreign rulers who behaved with more obvious deference. Cicero's discomfort is itself a data point. The people who made Cicero uncomfortable tended to be people who did not accept the implicit hierarchy that Cicero believed the world was organized around. She did not accept it. In March of 44 BC, Julius Caesar was assassinated. 23 stab wounds in the theater of Pompeii, at the feet of a statue of the man he had defeated, by a group of senators who called themselves liberators. Cleopatra was in Rome when it happened. She and Caesarion were in the city, in the villa across the Tiber, within reach of the chaos that followed. Rome descended immediately into the particular kind of panic that follows the sudden, violent removal of the person everyone had organized their lives around. Crowds gathered. Buildings burned. She was a foreign queen, in a city in crisis, with a 3-year-old child who bore the name and the blood of the man who had just been killed. She left Rome within weeks. She had been watching Caesar's political situation long enough to understand that it was not stable, that the resentments accumulating around him were real, that a man who had made himself indispensable had also made himself a target. The child was safe. She was safe. She was going home. And Rome, behind her, was beginning the next phase of its self-destruction. She watched it from Alexandria with the attention of someone who understood that what happened in Rome over the coming months and years was going to determine the conditions of her own survival. She was 26 years old. She had survived exile, war, the politics of the Ptolemaic court. 2 years in the most politically dangerous city in the world, and the sudden, violent death of the most powerful man she had ever known. She had Caesarion. She had Egypt. She went back to Alexandria, and she got to work. Chapter 6. The 4 years history tries to skip. Caesar died in March of 44 BC. Mark Antony did not arrive in Cleopatra's story until 41 BC. 3 years. More than 3 years. Actually, from the moment she left Rome with a 3-year-old child and a dead patron, to the moment she sailed into the harbor at Tarsus and changed everything again. Most accounts of Cleopatra's life treat this interval as a corridor, a passage between 2 more interesting rooms. They note that she returned to Egypt, that she dealt with some difficulties, and then they move quickly toward Antony, because Antony is where the drama is, where the romance is, where the story everyone came to hear begins in earnest. This is the wrong way to read those 3 years. Those 3 years are the proof of something the rest of the story, with its Roman generals and its naval battles and its grand geopolitical stakes, tends to obscure. Proof that Cleopatra was not a supporting character in other people's stories, who occasionally stepped into the foreground when the plot required her. She was the main character of her own story, running a complex and consequential operation, making decisions that affected millions of people, holding together a kingdom under real pressure, with no Roman patron and no military protector and no one to appeal to if things went wrong. She was 26 when Caesar died. She was 29 when she met Antony. Between those two ages, she ruled Egypt alone. Let us be specific about what that meant. Egypt in 44 BC was not at peace in any simple sense. It was a kingdom that had been politically unstable for decades, that had a recent history of internal conflict and Roman interference, and the specific economic strain that came from a dynasty that had spent several generations borrowing money it could not fully repay. The agricultural system of the Nile was reliable in good years and catastrophically vulnerable in bad ones, because the entire economy of the country depended on the annual flood reaching the right level. Too low, and the fields did not receive sufficient silt and moisture. Too high, and the flood destroyed rather than nourished. In 43 and 42 BC, the Nile flood failed. Not catastrophically, but significantly. The harvest was reduced enough that food prices rose, that the distribution systems that moved grain from surplus regions to deficit ones came under pressure, that the administrative machinery of the kingdom had to respond to a real crisis rather than simply managing normal operations. Cleopatra managed it. The records from this period are not extensive, which is partly because the years between Caesar and Antony were not the years that later historians found interesting enough to preserve in detail. But what survives is sufficient to show a ruler actively engaged in the practical work of governance. Tax adjustments, grain distribution orders, administrative appointments, the ongoing management of the relationship between the royal administration and the temple complexes that controlled significant agricultural land throughout the country. This is unglamorous work. It does not make for compelling narrative in the way that battles and romances do, but it is the work that actually determines whether a kingdom functions or fails. And the fact that Egypt did not collapse in these years, that it continued to generate the revenues and the agricultural surplus that made it valuable, is not an accident of geography. It is the result of administration, of someone making the right decisions consistently, over months and years. In conditions that were genuinely difficult, she was doing that. She was also watching Rome. The political situation after Caesar's assassination was changing faster than almost any observer could track. Mark Antony, Caesar's most prominent lieutenant, had initially seemed positioned to consolidate power. Then Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old great-nephew and adopted heir, had appeared from what seemed like nowhere and begun accumulating influence with a speed and a skill that surprised people who had dismissed him as a boy playing at politics. Brutus and Cassius, two of the assassins, had raised armies in the east and were preparing to fight for the republic they claimed to have defended by killing Caesar. Egypt had money and grain and ships. Every faction in Rome knew this. Cassius sent demanding military support for his campaign. She replied that Egypt was suffering from famine and plague and could not spare resources, which was at least partially true and entirely convenient. She was not going to commit Egypt's resources to a faction until she had a much clearer picture of which faction was going to win. This is sometimes described as weakness, as Cleopatra failing to take decisive action when decisiveness was required. It was the opposite. Committing prematurely to the wrong side in a Roman civil war was the worst mistake an Egyptian ruler could make. The correct move, when Rome was dividing against itself and the outcome was genuinely uncertain, was to watch, to gather information, to maintain enough relationships that you were not irreversibly committed to any of them, and to wait for the situation to clarify. She waited. In 42 BC, the Battle of Philippi clarified it. Antony and Octavian defeated Brutus and Cassius. Both of the assassins died. The world that followed Caesar belonged to the men who had won this war. 2 men, half the world each. Antony took the east. Octavian took the west. The arrangement was a pause, not a resolution. Everyone involved knew it. The question of who would ultimately control Rome and everything Rome controlled was not settled at Philippi. It was deferred. Cleopatra saw this clearly. She also saw something that would take Antony and Octavian years to work out between themselves. There could only be one ruler of Rome. The man who was not that ruler was always, by definition, the primary obstacle to the man who was. She had time. She did not know how much, but she had time, and she used it. There was one piece of internal business she had to resolve first. Her younger sister, Arsinoe. Arsinoe had been captured during the Alexandrian War, displayed in Caesar's triumph in Rome, and then sent to live in the sanctuary of the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. She was not imprisoned. She was in a gilded form of exile, alive and present in the Eastern Mediterranean as a standing alternative to Cleopatra, because that is what she was. Another Ptolemaic claimant, a sister who had declared herself queen during the Alexandrian War, who had Roman visibility from the triumph, and who was positioned, whether intentionally or not, as the person who could replace Cleopatra if the political situation made replacement convenient. She was not innocent. Innocence was not a quality the Ptolemaic palace allowed to survive long. What she was clear. Arsinoe was alive. Arsinoe was a Ptolemaic claimant with Roman visibility. In the logic of the world Cleopatra had grown up in, those facts pointed in one direction. She asked Antony to have her sister killed. Antony agreed. The execution happened in the sanctuary of the temple at Ephesus, which shocked people who had not been paying attention to how Cleopatra made decisions. She did not flinch from this. She had grown up in the Ptolemaic palace. She understood what having a rival claimant alive and accessible meant in practical terms. The calculation was brutal, and it was clear, and she made it with the directness of someone who had been making that kind of calculation her entire life. This is the Cleopatra who tends to get lost between the romance and the tragedy. Not the seductress, not the victim, the ruler who made hard decisions and accepted responsibility for them and kept the kingdom functioning because the kingdom was the point. The kingdom was always the point. She ruled. For 3 years she ruled. Alone. With the competence and the continuity that governance requires. She managed the Nile failures. She managed the Roman political situation from a distance, maintaining enough relationships in enough directions to avoid premature commitment. She raised Caesarion in the palace, building the institutional and symbolic infrastructure of his legitimacy within Egypt. She managed the temples and the priests, the administrative classes, the agricultural system, the trade networks, the treasury. She did all of this without Caesar, without any Roman patron, without the military protection that Roman backing had provided during the Alexandrian War. And then, in 41 BC, a Roman general named Mark Antony, newly positioned as the master of the Eastern Mediterranean, sent a summons to Alexandria. He wanted to meet the Queen of Egypt. He sent a summons. She did not rush to answer it. She was in the middle of running a country. She had been running it for 3 years without any Roman telling her what to do. She received the summons, considered it, and decided that when she responded, the response was going to communicate something that the summons had not anticipated. She was not a client queen waiting to be reviewed. She began planning, not for a meeting, for an entrance, because she had learned. In the years since the night she was carried into Caesar's presence, wrapped in a bed, covering with nothing but herself and her intelligence, that the way you enter a room shapes everything that happens inside it. First impressions in the world of power are not social niceties. They are opening arguments, and opening arguments, made well, establish the terms under which everything that follows is understood. She had been making opening arguments her entire life. This one was going to be the most carefully constructed thing she had ever done. Chapter 7. Antony and the Eastern Project. Tarsus, 40 Honor BC. Late summer, the city had turned out to watch, not because a Roman general was holding court there, though Mark Antony was doing exactly that, seated in the public square with the full apparatus of Roman administrative power arranged around him. Roman generals in their eastern territories were a familiar sight. A general holding court was not an event. What was happening at the harbour was an event. The ship that had appeared at the mouth of the river Cydnus was unlike anything the people of Tarsus had seen assembled in one place. The sails were purple, the colour that in the ancient world was produced from a specific species of sea snail at a cost so extraordinary that it functioned as a visual shorthand for wealth beyond ordinary reckoning. The oars were silver. The deck was covered with flowers. Musicians played on the prow. The rowers moved to the music, and the ship moved with them, and the entire vessel gave the impression not of transportation, but of ceremony, of something that had been built not to cross water, but to mean something in the crossing. At the center of it, under a canopy of gold cloth, attended by figures dressed as the sea nymphs of Greek mythology, sat Cleopatra. She was dressed as Isis. This was not costume. In the religious framework of Egypt, which Cleopatra had spent years studying and performing, with a seriousness that her predecessors had never managed, Isis was not simply a goddess among others. She was the goddess of sovereignty, the divine mother, the figure who, in Egyptian theological tradition, legitimized the rule of the Pharaoh, because the Pharaoh ruled as Horus, the son of Isis. By appearing as Isis, Cleopatra was not making a theatrical choice. She was making a theological one. She was arriving in Tarsus, not as a client queen answering a summons, but as a divine figure whose legitimacy predated Rome by 3,000 years. The people of Tarsus understood this, or felt it, which amounts to the same thing. They left the square. The crowd that had gathered to watch Mark Antony hold court simply walked away, down to the harbour, to see the ship. Antony sat in the square with his officials and his advisers and the institutional machinery of Roman Eastern power. And the city that was supposed to be paying attention to him was paying attention to something else. He was left alone in the square with his attendants. He sent an invitation. Would she dine with him that evening? She sent back a counter-invitation. Would he dine with her? On the ship. He accepted. This is the moment that the legend reaches for first. And it is genuinely worth reaching for. But not for the reasons the legend usually assigns. It is worth reaching for because it shows, in compressed and vivid form, exactly how Cleopatra understood power and how she exercised it. She had been summoned. She arrived on her own timeline. She arrived in a manner that established, before a single word was spoken, that she was not the supplicant in this meeting. She redirected his invitation into her space, onto her ship, under conditions she controlled. And she did all of this not through confrontation, but through spectacle, through the specific genius of making the thing you want to happen feel like the natural and inevitable thing. Now, let us talk about Antony, because the legend of Cleopatra requires Antony to be diminished, and the diminishment does a disservice to both of them. Mark Antony, in 41 BC, was approximately 42 years old. He was one of the most experienced military commanders in the Roman world, with a record of genuine achievement across decades of campaigning. But to understand what made him extraordinary, you have to go back to what he actually was before the story Octavian told about him became the story everyone repeated. He had grown up in one of Rome's old aristocratic families, trained in the rhetoric and military arts that Roman public life demanded. He went east as a young man and proved himself good enough at the actual work of soldiering that Caesar noticed him and brought him onto his staff for the campaigns in Gaul. What Caesar found in Antony was not simply a competent officer. He found someone with a specific quality that great commanders prize above almost everything else in a subordinate. Antony could hold a situation together when it was falling apart. When the plan had failed, and the men around him were beginning to register the specific fear that comes from not knowing what to do next, Antony did not panic. He adapted. He improvised with the speed and the confidence of someone who trusted his own judgment enough to act on it before all the information was in. That quality is rare. Caesar recognized it and used it, sending Antony to the situations that required it most. After Caesar's death, Antony demonstrated the other dimension of this quality. The funeral oration he delivered in the Forum over Caesar's body, with the assassins still in Rome and the political situation entirely unresolved, was one of the great acts of political courage and rhetorical skill in Roman history. He stood in front of a crowd that could have gone in any direction, and he turned it, not through lies, through the specific manipulation of true things, arranged in an order and delivered with an emotion that produced, in the crowd, the response that the moment required. He was genuinely gifted. In military command, in political maneuvering, in the interpersonal dimensions of leadership that no amount of strategic intelligence can substitute for. He was also something that the sources, which were largely shaped by the Octavian victory narrative, tend to understate. He was thoughtful, not in every way. He had a temper. He could be reckless. He liked wine and spectacle and the company of people who shared his appetite for abundance. But he was also a man who had spent decades navigating the most complex political environment in the ancient world. And that navigation required a quality of mind that simple commanders did not possess. He was capable of seeing things clearly. And what he saw in Cleopatra, from that first meeting in Tarsus, was not what the legend records. He saw a peer. He had met extraordinary women before. He had been married multiple times and had relationships with women across the Roman world. But a peer was different. A peer was someone whose intelligence operated at the same level as yours, who could match you across the range of things that mattered to you, who did not require adjustment or simplification in the way that most conversations required. A peer was rare, and Antony had not had many of them. She was also, and this needs to be said plainly, someone whose resources he needed. The Eastern campaigns that Antony had in mind, particularly the campaign against Parthia that had eluded Roman generals for decades, required money, supplies, and a base of operations. Egypt had all three. Cleopatra knew he needed these things. He knew she knew. The relationship that developed between them was personal and also strategic, and both dimensions were real, and pretending that either one did not exist is a falsification of what actually happened. They were in love, or something close enough to love that the distinction does not matter much. They were also in a partnership of mutual necessity. These things were not in conflict. What they built together was something that neither of them could have built alone. A vision of how the Eastern Mediterranean could be organized under a different kind of authority than the purely Roman authority that Octavian was in the process of constructing in the West. Antony controlled the East. Cleopatra controlled Egypt. Together they had resources, military power, and the political standing to make a genuine claim on the future shape of Roman power. They spent the winter of 41 to 40 BC together in Alexandria. He went back to Rome in 40 BC. He married Octavia, Octavian's sister. As part of the arrangement that temporarily stabilized the relationship between the two men who were dividing the world between them, the marriage was political, which everyone involved understood. He came back to Cleopatra in 37 BC. By then she had borne him twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the sun and the moon. In 37 BC, he formalized what had been implicit since Tarsus. He gave her territory, not as a gift, as a political recognition. The eastern lands that had been under Ptolemaic control before Rome had absorbed them were returned to Egyptian administration. For Cleopatra, this was the closest thing to her father's dream in reverse, not Egypt bowing to Rome, but Rome acknowledging what Egypt represented. In return, she funded his Parthian campaign. The campaign proved to be the greatest military failure of his career. He advanced into Parthian territory and lost his siege equipment to a strike on his supply lines. Without it, the campaign could not proceed. He was forced to retreat through hostile territory in the Armenian winter, losing tens of thousands of men to cold and starvation and the relentless pressure of mounted archers who harassed the retreating columns for weeks. He came to Cleopatra's coast with what remained of his army. For Antony, Parthia was a military disaster. For Cleopatra, it was something more specific, confirmation that the man she had bet Egypt's future on was not invincible. She rebuilt his forces anyway. She sent money and supplies and the administrative capacity of Egypt to bear on the problem of reconstituting a force that had been badly damaged, because the alternative was not a better ally. It was no ally at all. In 34 BC, Antony staged what became known as the Donations of Alexandria, a public ceremony in which he distributed territories across the eastern Mediterranean to Cleopatra and to their children. Cleopatra as Queen of Kings, Caesarion as King of Kings. In Rome, Octavian read the news and began to prepare. The story he had been building was ready to be finished. Chapter 8. Octavian writes the war before he wins it. Rome, 36 BC. The war had not started yet. No armies had moved. No fleets had assembled. No formal declaration had been made. But Octavian had already started the war. He had started it in the only place that ultimately mattered. In the story, Rome was telling itself about what was happening. To understand what Octavian did in the years between 36 and 31 BC, you have to understand something about how power worked in the late Roman Republic that is easy to miss if you are focused on armies and battles and the conventional machinery of ancient warfare. Rome was not a modern state with a centralized information apparatus. What it had instead was a set of channels through which information and interpretation moved through the population. Speeches in the Forum and the Senate, the poems and histories produced by writers who depended on wealthy patrons, the rumors that circulated through the social networks of Roman aristocratic life, the visual language of public monuments and coinage, and the ceremonies that punctuated the Roman calendar. Octavian understood these channels better than anyone alive. He had been studying them since he was 18 years old. since the moment he arrived in Rome, after Caesar's assassination, as an unknown young man with a famous name and nothing else, and had proceeded, through a combination of patience and intelligence and the specific ruthlessness of someone who understood that sentiment was a luxury he could not afford, to build himself into the dominant political force in the Western Mediterranean in less than 15 years. He did not do this primarily through military force, though he used military force when he needed to. He did it through narrative, through the sustained, careful, structurally sophisticated construction of a story about himself and about his opponents that was designed not to inform but to persuade, not to describe but to define. The story he had been building about Antony and Cleopatra was a masterpiece of the form. Rome, in the mid-30s BC, was a city exhausted by civil war. The Roman public had been living with internal military conflict at various levels of intensity for the better part of 2 decades. They were interested in stability, in the restoration of something that felt like the old Rome, in a leader who could promise that the cycle of violence was finished. Octavian positioned himself as that leader. But positioning yourself as the restorer of peace requires, with a logic that is uncomfortable but inescapable, a threat to peace that you are protecting Rome from. You cannot be the savior without a danger to save from. And the danger Octavian identified, and then constructed, and then amplified through every channel available to him, was Cleopatra, not Antony. Not primarily. Antony was a Roman, and framing the conflict as Roman against Roman was exactly what Octavian needed to avoid. A Roman civil war was just another round of the exhausting cycle, but a war against a foreign queen, an Eastern monarch who had corrupted a Roman general and was now using him as an instrument to extend her power over Rome itself. That was something different. That was Rome defending itself against an external threat. So Antony had to become Cleopatra's instrument, and Cleopatra had to become the danger. The claims were specific and targeted. Antony was living in Alexandria like an Eastern monarch, wearing Greek dress, participating in Egyptian religious ceremonies, ignoring his Roman obligations. This was true, in a selective sense, and the selection was the point. Many Roman commanders who served in the East adopted local customs to varying degrees, but Octavian stripped the context and presented the behavior in isolation, as evidence of a man who had forgotten what he was. Antony had been bewitched, enchanted, controlled. The Roman vocabulary for this drew on a tradition of anxiety about Eastern magic and Eastern women that ran deep in Roman culture. The fear that the sophisticated, ancient, culturally dominant civilizations of the East could corrupt Roman virtue simply through proximity and contact. Cleopatra was cast as the agent of this corruption, not a political opponent, not a head of state pursuing her own national interests, but a sorceress who had deployed the weapons of feminine influence against a man who should have known better. And then there were the poets. Octavian was one of the great patrons of Latin literature in the history of Rome. Not accidentally. He understood that the writers of his era, given resources and encouragement, would produce work that shaped how Romans understood their world for generations. Virgil was writing the Aeneid under Augustan patronage, the foundational epic of Roman identity. Horace was writing odes that celebrated Roman virtue and Roman order. Propertius was writing about love and war in ways that positioned the Eastern world, and Eastern women, as specific kinds of threat. In the 4th book of Propertius, Cleopatra appears as Meretrix Regina. 2 words, deployed by a poet of genuine talent, working within a system that rewarded alignment with the emerging Augustan narrative. Horace described the threat she represented as a fatale monstrum, a deadly monster. These were not journalism. They were not even history. They were art, produced by artists of real ability, within a patronage system that shaped what art was rewarded, and they were effective in ways that direct propaganda rarely achieves. Because art reaches places that argument cannot. It creates images that lodge in memory. It builds emotional associations that outlast the specific political circumstances that produced them. The image of Cleopatra that these poets built is the image that the Western world has been living with for 2,000 years. Now here is the thing that requires the most direct confrontation. We know about Cleopatra almost entirely through sources that were shaped by this propaganda. Plutarch, who is the most detailed ancient source for the personal dimensions of her story, was writing more than a century after her death, in a Rome that had been living with the Augustan narrative for generations. He was a careful and thoughtful writer who was also a man of his time, reading sources that had themselves been produced within a system that Octavian had constructed. Dio Cassius wrote even later, and his account is more hostile still. What does this mean for everything we think we know about Cleopatra? It means that the boundary between history and propaganda is, in her case, genuinely difficult to locate. For a general audience receiving the popular version of her story, the boundary is almost never acknowledged. The meretrix Regina of Propertius and the calculating seductress of later storytelling and the Elizabeth Taylor of the 1963 film exist in a continuous line of transmission that began with a political decision made by a man in Rome who needed to win a war before it started. Cleopatra was alive when this was happening. She was in Alexandria, running Egypt, aware that the story being told about her in Rome was not the story she would have told about herself, and unable to fully counter it. This is the specific powerlessness that the situation imposed on her, and it was more complete than any military disadvantage. She could win battles. She could not win the story that Octavian was telling in a city she did not control, through channels she could not access, to an audience she could not reach. Meanwhile, Antony was providing Octavian with material not through stupidity, through honesty, which in this context produced the same result. The donations of Alexandria were exactly what Octavian needed. He described them in Rome not as a political arrangement, but as evidence of Antony's transformation from Roman general to Eastern king, from the servant of Rome to the consort of its enemy. Then there was the will. In 32 BC, Antony's will was deposited with the Vestal Virgins in Rome. As Roman custom required, Octavian did something that violated both the custom and the law. He took the will from the Vestals and read it publicly in the Senate. Antony requested that he be buried in Alexandria, beside Cleopatra, a Roman requesting burial in a foreign city, beside a foreign queen, rather than in Rome, was an act without precedent in Roman memory. Burial customs were not trivial matters in Roman culture. Where you were buried, and with whom, was a statement about who you were, where you belonged, and what you valued. Antony's will said, in terms that no Roman could misread, that he had chosen Alexandria over Rome. Octavian did not need to interpret this. He let it interpret itself. The Senate responded by stripping Antony of his command and his consular authority. Octavian declared war, not on Antony, which would have been civil war, on Cleopatra. Rome was going to war against the Queen of Egypt, The legal framing was precise and deliberate. By declaring war on Cleopatra, rather than on Antony, Octavian converted what was actually a Roman civil war into a foreign war. He gave it the moral valence of defense rather than aggression. He made it possible for Romans who had been exhausted by civil war to support this conflict as something categorically different. It was not categorically different. It was Octavian against Antony. It had always been Octavian against Antony, but the story said otherwise. And the story was winning. In Alexandria, Cleopatra understood what was happening. She was watching Octavian construct, in real time, the narrative that would outlast her by 2,000 years. She was watching the story of who she was being written by her enemy, in a language and a city she could not control, for an audience she could not reach. She was also preparing for war, because the story, however powerful, was not yet the only thing that mattered. There was still a battle to be fought. There was still a fleet to be assembled, and an army to be organized, and a military confrontation to be survived. She was the most clear-eyed person in Alexandria about the odds. She had been clear-eyed about odds her entire life, because the alternative to clarity was the comfortable illusion that had gotten her father's dynasty to the position it was now in. The odds were not good. They were not impossible. She started to plan, not for victory in the simple sense. She was too honest for that kind of fantasy, for a version of the future that preserved something, that kept something alive, that ensured that whatever happened on the battlefield, the story did not end in the way Octavian was writing it. She was still looking for the room she had to enter. She did not know yet that this time the room did not have a door. Chapter 9. Antony. The Roman, who became the warning. There is a specific kind of tragedy that history tends to misread. Not the tragedy of the villain who gets what he deserves. Not the tragedy of the hero who falls through a flaw so obvious that the audience can see it coming long before the character does. Those are clean tragedies, satisfying in the way that things are satisfying when the pieces fit together neatly at the end. The tragedy of Mark Antony is not clean. It is the tragedy of a man who was defeated not primarily by his enemies, not primarily by his own failures, but by a story that was told about him while he was still alive and that he could not escape because the story was being told in a place he no longer controlled, in a language he no longer set the terms of, by a man who understood something about power that Antony, for all his genuine greatness, never fully grasped. Octavian understood that in the world being born around him, military victory and narrative victory were not the same thing and did not always go to the same person. You could lose a battle and win the war if you controlled how the battle was remembered. The most durable power was not the power that defeated its enemies, but the power that defined them. He defined Antony, and Antony, being the kind of man he was, helped him do it. The triumvirate that Antony and Octavian had formed after Philippi was a partnership of mutual necessity between two men who were temperamentally incapable of genuine partnership. Antony responded to situations as they came. Octavian constructed situations. Antony made decisions based on what he wanted. Octavian made decisions based on what the decisions would produce 10 steps later. Antony thought they were still in the world of Roman aristocratic competition, where powerful men maneuvered against each other for advantage, but within a shared framework of norms and the unspoken understanding that the competition had limits. Octavian was not playing that game. Octavian was playing the game that came after that game. The game where the shared framework itself was the target, where the norms that had constrained Roman political competition for centuries were instruments to be used or discarded as they served the project of consolidating absolute power. Octavian was not competing within the Roman system. He was replacing it. Antony never fully registered this. The marriage to Octavia, Antony's Roman wife and Octavian's sister, was the arrangement that temporarily stabilized the relationship between the two men. It bought time. It did not create trust. When Antony went back to Cleopatra in 37 BC and formalized the Eastern project, he was making a choice that he understood had consequences in Rome. He was not naive about this. He knew Octavian would use the relationship against him. He made the choice anyway. He was choosing a vision of the future that looked different from Octavian's vision, and he was making that choice with his eyes open. The problem was not that he chose. The problem was that he chose without fully understanding that Octavian was playing a different game. The Parthian failure made everything worse. He had staked an enormous amount on it, materially and symbolically. A victory against Parthia would have restored the strategic momentum he had lost to Octavian's maneuvering in the West. Instead, he returned with a shattered army and a reputation that Octavian was already working to finish destroying. Octavian made his move. He sent Octavia to the east with a modest amount of supplies, just enough to be described as support, not enough to actually change anything. Antony refused to see Octavia. She returned to Rome. Octavian wept publicly for his sister's honor. The performance was calculated to a degree that makes the word performance seem insufficient. It was a work of political theater staged for an audience of millions, by a man who had been rehearsing it for years. Rome believed it. In 32 BC, a significant number of Antony's Roman supporters in the Senate crossed over to Octavian. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic defection. In the gradual, quietly devastating way that institutional support erodes when the people who hold it have decided that the calculation has shifted. They had served Antony. They had believed in the arrangement, and now they looked at him, and they saw not the man they had served, but the man in the story Octavian had been telling, the man who had chosen Alexandria over Rome, who had rejected his Roman wife for a foreign queen, who had conducted himself in ways that made the people around him increasingly uncertain about which world he actually belonged to. The story had done its work. Antony divorced Octavia formally and publicly. From a personal standpoint, it was an honest act. From a political standpoint, it was giving Octavian a weapon he had not yet fully deployed. Octavian deployed it immediately. The Senate voted to strip Antony of his authority. The declaration of war followed, not against Antony, against Cleopatra. In Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra received the news together. What passed between them in those days is not recorded in any source that survived. The ancient writers who describe this period were working from accounts produced in Octavian's Rome, shaped by the narrative that his victory had made dominant. And those accounts were not interested in preserving the interior experience of two people who had built something together and were now watching it come apart under pressures they could not fully contain. What we can say is what the record shows they did. They prepared for war, together, with the systematic, professional, unsentimental efficiency of two people who had been doing hard things in hard circumstances for their entire adult lives, and who understood that the time for processing what was happening was not now. Some of Antony's Roman officers argued that Cleopatra should return to Egypt and wait. She did not return to Egypt and wait. She had not come this far, had not built this much, had not fought for this long, to be sent home while the outcome of her kingdom's future was decided without her. She stayed. She was there when the fleet assembled. She was there for the planning. She was there for Actium, And Actium was not what the story Octavian told made it. It was the end of a world, conducted over the course of a single afternoon in September of 31 BC, on the water off the coast of Greece, in full view of two armies that had been staring at each other across a narrow strait for months, while the situation deteriorated in ways that made the battle almost beside the point by the time it was finally fought. The man who sailed into it was not the Antony of 30 years of Roman military achievement. He was a man who had been losing the war that mattered for years before a single ship left harbor. He knew it. She knew it. They fought anyway, because that was what they were. Chapter 10. Actium, the battle that became a verdict. September 2nd, 31 BC. The water off the coast of Actium, at the mouth of the Ambracian Gulf on the western coast of Greece, was calm in the early morning. It would not stay calm. What happened that day has been described as a naval battle, and it was. Technically, ships engaged. Men fought and died on the water. One side withdrew and the other held the field. By the formal accounting of ancient warfare, Actium was a battle, and Octavian won it. But to call it simply a battle is to miss what it actually was. Actium was the final expression of a defeat that had been accumulating for years. It was the moment when everything that Octavian had built through propaganda and political maneuvering and the patient erosion of Antony's support base arrived at its military conclusion. The ships were almost beside the point. The outcome had been shaped long before the first oar hit the water. To understand this, you have to understand what Antony's situation looked like in the months before the battle. He had positioned his forces at Actium in the spring of 31 BC, establishing a camp on the southern promontory of the Gulf with his fleet inside and his army on land. Octavian's General Agrippa, one of the most gifted naval commanders in Roman history, had arrived before Antony was fully prepared and had begun doing something methodical and devastating. He was not attacking the camp directly. He was picking off Antony's supply lines, un by un. The ports that fed Antony's forces were taken. The routes by which grain and supplies moved from Egypt and from the territories that still supported him were cut or threatened. The fleet inside the Gulf began to run short of provisions. The army on land began to feel the strain of diminishing supply. Disease arrived. In the summer heat, with supply lines disrupted and the camp becoming increasingly crowded and unsanitary, sickness moved through the troops. And then the defection started. Not ordinary soldiers, commanders, men who had served Antony for years, who knew him and had fought beside him, and who now, reading the situation with the hard clarity of professional military men, began crossing over to Octavian. Domitius Aenobarbus, one of Antony's most senior officers, left by rowboat in the night. He was sick, and he would die within days of his defection. But he went. Others followed. Kings and client rulers who had pledged their support to the Eastern project quietly withdrew that support and sent word to Octavian that they were available for different arrangements. Each defection was a signal. The people who had been watching this situation longest had concluded that the outcome was no longer genuinely uncertain. By the time September arrived, Antony held a council of war. The options were not good. The evidence suggests that what was planned at Actium was not a decisive naval engagement but a breakout, an attempt to preserve the treasury and the fleet and whatever future remained. Rather than lose everything in a battle, the preceding months had already decided. Cleopatra's squadron, carrying the Egyptian treasury and a significant portion of the fleet's resources, would move through the battle when an opening appeared and escape south toward Egypt. Antony's forces would fight to create that opening. The battle began in the early afternoon. Agrippa's fleet was larger and better supplied, crewed by men who had not spent months being worn down by disease and inadequate food. Antony's forces fought. The fighting was genuine, and the outcome was not immediately obvious. It was not a rout. It was a contest that lasted hours. At some point in the afternoon, Cleopatra's squadron saw the opening they had been waiting for. The wind had shifted. A gap existed in the encircling line. She took the Egyptian fleet through it. She ran before the wind with 60 ships and the treasury of Egypt and whatever future was still possible. Antony followed with a small number of ships. What happened to the rest of his fleet completed the disaster. The ships that remained, seeing their commander gone, fighting an engagement they could not win, surrendered or burned. By the time the afternoon was over, the fleet that had been Antony's primary military asset was gone. The army on land, which had not been part of the sea battle, received the news the following day and surrendered without significant resistance. Octavian had won. Now here is where the story that survived, the story Octavian needed, diverges most sharply from the story that actually happened. In the version Octavian constructed, Cleopatra fled in panic or in cowardice, and Antony, besotted and unmanned by his love for her, abandoned his forces and his duty to chase after her. The battle was lost because a Roman general chose a woman over his responsibilities. This version required the audience to believe that Antony, who had spent 30 years as one of the most experienced and courageous military commanders in the Roman world, who had fought in conditions far worse than Actium and had not run, who had demonstrated in battle after battle the specific quality of holding his nerve under pressure, suddenly lost all of that at Actium because of emotional attachment. It required the audience to believe that Cleopatra, who had spent 20 years making the hardest possible decisions with clarity and without sentiment, who had ordered the execution of her own sister without flinching, who had managed the collapse of every major alliance she had built and had always found a way to continue, panicked on a ship in the middle of a planned operation. Neither of these things is what the record supports. What the record supports is a planned breakout that succeeded in its primary objective of preserving the treasury and the queen, and failed in its secondary objective of preserving the rest of the fleet, which was always the more uncertain part of the plan. But the version Octavian told was simpler, and simpler stories win. He returned to Rome as the savior of the Republic. The Senate voted him honors that accumulated into something that no Republican framework could contain. He was the man who had protected Rome from the Eastern Queen and ended the cycle of civil war by winning the last one. The story wrote itself. He had been writing it for years to make sure it would. In Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra arrived to a city that was still intact, still functioning, still the greatest urban center in the Eastern Mediterranean. They had the treasury, they had time, they had the specific quality of two people who had been in impossible situations before and who had not yet found the bottom of their capacity to think clearly under pressure. They tried to plan. Antony sent to Octavian. The terms he offered were not the terms of a man who had accepted defeat. He proposed arrangements that would preserve some version of the Eastern project, some form of continued Ptolemaic governance in Egypt. Octavian did not respond to Antony. He responded to Cleopatra. The response he sent was careful and calibrated and designed to do exactly what it did, which was to make her wonder whether a separate arrangement was possible, whether the war that Octavian had declared was against her. Personally, might be ended on terms that preserved something, if not for Antony. He was telling her what she needed to hear to keep her in Alexandria and alive until he arrived. She understood this. She had understood it from the beginning. But understanding that you are being managed and being able to act outside the management are not the same thing. And the options were narrowing in a way that all of her intelligence could observe but not reverse. Antony made one more military effort, a sortie against Octavian's advancing forces that briefly seemed to go well and then collapsed when his cavalry defected at the critical moment. He came back to Alexandria, convinced that Cleopatra had somehow arranged or encouraged the defection. He was wrong. The cavalry made its own calculation. The same calculation that every other force in the eastern Mediterranean had been making for months. It had nothing to do with her. She did not have time to be right about this in any satisfying way. Events were moving too fast. Octavian's forces entered Alexandria without significant resistance in late July of 30 BC. Antony received a false report that Cleopatra was dead. He fell on his sword. He did not die immediately. He was carried to the mausoleum, where Cleopatra had retreated with her treasury and her remaining attendants. And he died there, with her, some hours after the wound. She held him while he died. What she felt in those hours is not something the historical record preserves. The sources describe the scene from outside. They give us the physical facts. They do not give us the interior experience of a woman who had spent 11 years building something with a man and who was now holding him as he left. We do not need the ancient sources to imagine it. Some things require no documentation. Octavian was in Alexandria. He had won the war. He had won the world. And Cleopatra was still alive. That was the problem. The triumph required her. He came to see her. She knew why. The last battle was about to begin. Not on water. Not on land. In a room. Between two people. With everything still to be decided. Chapter 11. The death Rome could not own. She received him in the mausoleum. She was ill. The sources describe physical symptoms consistent with grief and exhaustion and the specific bodily aftermath of sustained extreme stress. She had injuries on her chest that she had made in the initial moment of learning that Antony was dying. She was not at her best. In the physical sense, she was entirely herself. In every other sense. Octavian entered the room and found a queen, not a defeated woman in disarray, not a suppliant waiting to learn her fate. A woman who had bathed and dressed in the manner appropriate to her station, and who received the most powerful man in the world with the composure of someone who had decided, before he walked through the door, exactly how this conversation was going to be conducted. She spoke first. She presented her case. She offered an accounting of the treasury, with detailed records, and when one of her servants suggested that she had concealed some portion of it, she responded with an anger that was not performance but genuine. The anger of a woman who was determined that even in this moment she would not be diminished by a subordinate's suggestion that she was being less than fully honest. Octavian observed her. He was a different kind of man, entirely from Caesar. Colder, more controlled, less susceptible to the quality of engagement that had kept Caesar in Alexandria longer than he intended. He was not there to be impressed. He was there to manage. He told her what she wanted to hear. He was not planning a triumph that would humiliate her. He had other arrangements in mind. She would be treated with dignity. Her children would be considered. He was lying. She knew he was lying. He knew she knew. It was the kind of conversation that two intelligent people have when both of them understand what is actually happening, and neither of them has any use for the pretense that they do not. What Octavian needed from her was time. He needed her alive and in Alexandria until he could arrange the transport to Rome that his triumph required. He needed to prevent her from doing what every instinct she had was telling her to do. He sent guards. He had her watched. He had her attended by people whose job was, among other things, to ensure that she did not find a way to end things on her own terms before he was ready. She was thinking about her children. Caesarion was 17. She had sent him south along the Nile, toward Ethiopia, with enough resources to reach safety, if safety could be reached. She had sent word to him to keep moving. Then she understood what Octavian would have to do. Whether she received the exact news, or simply understood with the clarity of someone who had been reading power her entire life, what the situation required. The calculation was the same. A 17-year-old boy with Caesar's blood and a claim older than Octavian's could not be allowed to exist. Caesarion was gone. The last variable resolved itself. She had been weighing, in the days since Antony's death, the precise dimensions of what she faced. She made it as she had made every calculation in her life, by looking at what was actually there, and what it actually meant, and what the options actually were. The options, after Caesarion, were to, she could live. Living meant Rome. It meant the journey by ship across the Mediterranean as a prisoner. It meant the streets of Rome, which she had walked as a queen 20 years earlier and would now walk in chains, with crowds throwing things and Octavian on his chariot above her, and the entire spectacle designed to produce, in the people watching, the specific pleasure of seeing power humiliated. And then, after the triumph, death, a strangling in a cell somewhere, which was the traditional end of the honored guest at a Roman triumph, or imprisonment of a form that was technically alive but amounted to erasure. She could die. Dying meant choosing. It meant exercising, in the moment when no other exercise of choice was available, the only sovereignty she still possessed, the sovereignty over her own ending. She had spent her entire life refusing to let other people write the most important parts of her story. She was not going to let Octavian write this one. She made her preparations with the thoroughness that characterized everything she did. She requested a visit to Antony's tomb, which Octavian allowed. She went and performed the funeral rites and said what she had to say to him in whatever privacy remained to her in a situation where she was constantly watched. She returned to the mausoleum. She bathed. She dressed in the full regalia of the Queen of Egypt. The garments and the jewelry and the crown that made the statement she intended to make. She ordered a meal, a good one, and she ate it. She wrote a letter to Octavian requesting that she be buried with Antony. She sealed it and sent it. When Octavian's people read the letter and understood what it meant and sent men to the mausoleum, they were too late. She was dead. Her 2 attendants were dying or dead beside her. The method is what legend has fixed on ever since. The asp, the cobra, the snake brought in a basket of figs, biting her on the arm or on the breast, depending on which source you read. Octavian's physician examined her body and found marks that might have been consistent with a snake bite. But the historical record preserves no definitive conclusion. There were also many substances available in the ancient world that could produce death without leaving marks that a physician could identify with certainty. What is certain is something different. The cobra is the royal symbol in Egyptian tradition. The uraeus, the rearing cobra on the pharaoh's crown, is one of the most ancient images of Egyptian kingship. If she chose the snake deliberately, and she was a woman who chose everything deliberately, she was choosing to die by the symbol of the office she had held, dying as the pharaoh, not as the captive Whether the snake was real, or symbolic, or both. She chose, she arranged, she executed. In the last hours of her life, when Octavian controlled everything else, she controlled this. Octavian was furious, not grief-stricken, not moved, furious, because the triumph he had been building toward for years was now incomplete. He had the treasury, he had Egypt, he had the world. What he did not have was her, alive, walking through the streets of Rome in chains. He did what he could. He had a wax effigy of her made, depicting her with a serpent on her arm, and he included it in the triumph in her place. The Roman crowd, which had been denied the real thing, watched the effigy pass. She was not there. She was in Alexandria, in the tomb she had asked for, buried with Antony. She had gotten the last thing she asked for. She had written her own ending, in the only language still available to her, in the only space Octavian had failed to fully occupy, her body. Egypt became a Roman province in 30 BC, not a normal province. Octavian, who would become Augustus within a few years, made Egypt his personal possession in a way that was legally and administratively distinct from how Rome governed other, conquered territories. No Roman senator could enter Egypt without the emperor's explicit permission. The grain that flowed from the Nile to Rome flowed now under imperial administration. The most valuable territory in the ancient world had become the personal property of the man who had just become the first emperor of Rome. The Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 250 years ended with Cleopatra. Her children by Antony were taken to Rome and raised in the household of Octavia, Antony's Roman wife. The woman whose husband had left her for Cleopatra raised Cleopatra's children. History does not record what Octavia felt about this arrangement. She did it anyway, which tells you something about her character that the sources, shaped as they are by her brother's interests, do not fully illuminate. Cleopatra Selene, the daughter, eventually married the king of Mauritania and ruled as a queen in North Africa. She named her son Ptolemy. She did not forget where she came from. And Cleopatra became a legend. Rome needed her as a legend even more than it had needed her alive. The dangerous Eastern queen, the sorceress who had unmanned Rome's greatest general, the seductress whose weapons were not armies but something more intimate and more insidious. The legend served Augustus, and he cultivated it, because a legend can be controlled in ways that a living, intelligent, politically sophisticated woman cannot. But something happened that Augustus did not plan for. The legend grew beyond his control. For Shakespeare, writing 1600 years after her death, she became the most fully realized female character in his work, complex and contradictory, and impossible to reduce to a single judgment. For the 20th century, in Elizabeth Taylor's performance in 1963, she became the image that most people carry when they hear her name, and for every generation between and after, she has been something different, something necessary, something that the era required her to be in order to think through what it needed to think through. This does not happen with figures whose stories are genuinely finished. Augustus built the Roman Empire. He reorganized its government, reformed its laws, commissioned its greatest literature, constructed its most enduring monuments. He was, by any reasonable accounting of historical impact, one of the most consequential figures in the history of Western civilization. He is not the one that people cannot stop talking about. She is, and the reason she is has nothing to do with beauty or with Caesar. or with the snake. It has to do with what she actually was. The girl who learned 9 languages in a palace where her sister was executed. The queen who built an army in the desert at 21. The ruler who governed alone for 4 years that history tries to skip. The woman who walked into the most important rooms in the ancient world and made them hers. Not because she was beautiful, but because she was the most prepared person there, and the Pharaoh who, when the last room had no door, found the only exit that was still hers to choose. She already knew he was coming. She had always known, with that same precision, what she was going to do about it. That was who she was. Rome buried the kingdom. It could not bury the question, and the question still has her name.